Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ali, your host for today's mystery. We're joining Hercule Poirot today in the glamorous yet treacherous world of Roman high society, where art, passion, and deadly secrets collide at a charity ball in the magnificent Palazzo Medici. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments if you like the story. Please hit the like button. Your unwavering support means the world to me. Now, settle in with a warm cup of espresso, and let's uncover this mystery together. I have always believed that truth emerges most clearly through careful observation and methodical analysis, principles that have served me well throughout my career as an art historian. It is with this same scholarly objectivity that I set down these events. Though I confess the circumstances surrounding the tragedy at the Palazzo Medici have shaken even my academic composure. My name is Dr. Marcus Fairfax, and for the past 18 months, I have had the considerable privilege of cataloging the extraordinary art collection housed within Rome's magnificent Palazzo Medici. The commission came to me through the Royal Institute of Art History, and I accepted it with the enthusiasm that any scholar would feel when presented with such treasures. The Palazzo's current mistress, Contessa Valentina Rossetti, had inherited not merely a palace, but a veritable museum of Renaissance masterpieces, many of which had never been properly documented or authenticated. The Contessa herself was a woman of remarkable presence, striking rather than beautiful, with the sort of commanding personality that seemed to draw all attention to her whenever she entered a room. She possessed that peculiar combination of charm and steel that one often finds in those born to wealth and position. Her knowledge of art was superficial but enthusiastic, and she took considerable pride in her collection, though I sometimes suspected she valued the prestige it brought her more than the works themselves. It was during my third month at the Palazzo that I first encountered her sister, Miss Lucia Rossetti. The contrast between the two women could not have been more pronounced. Where Valentina was all commanding presence and calculated elegance, Lucia moved through the world with an almost ethereal gentleness that immediately caught one's attention. She was perhaps 5 years younger than her sister, with delicate features and an air of quiet intelligence that I found most appealing from a scholarly perspective. Lucia had established a small jewelry shop in one of the Palazzo's unused chambers, where she created the most exquisite pieces, works that demonstrated not merely artistic talent, but a deep understanding of craftsmanship that I, as someone trained to appreciate fine workmanship, could not help but admire. Her designs showed an innovative spirit combined with respect for traditional techniques, a combination I found intellectualistinum. It became my habit, when my cataloging work permitted, to visit her workshop. Our conversations invariably centered on matters of artistic technique and historical precedent, discussions that I found refreshingly free from the social posturing that characterized most interactions within the Palazzo's walls. Lucia possessed a genuine curiosity about the pieces I was documenting, and her questions often revealed insights that had escaped my initial examination. "Dr. Fairfax," she said one afternoon, as I examined a particularly fine Chigi bronze, "do y'all think it's possible for an artist to hide their true intentions within their work, to create something that appears to serve one purpose while actually serving another entirely?" The question struck me as unusually philosophical for our typical discussions of metallurgy and provenance. An intriguing thought, Miss Rossetti. Certainly, many Renaissance artists embedded symbolic meanings within their works, messages that would be clear to educated viewers, but invisible to others. She nodded thoughtfully, her fingers absently working a piece of silver wire as we spoke. "Yes, but I mean something more practical. Could one create an object that functions perfectly for its apparent purpose, while concealing an entirely different capability?" I found myself impressed by the sophistication of her thinking. Innovation often comes from such dual-purpose considerations. Take the walking sticks of the 18th century. Many appeared to be simple gentlemen sissies, while actually concealing sword blades or other implements. Exactly. Her face lit up with enthusiasm, and I confess I found her excitement quite charming. Function disguised within beauty, necessity hidden within art. Our scholarly discussions inevitably led to my learning more about the family dynamics within the Palazzo. Lucia, I discovered, lived entirely in her sister's shadow, dependent upon Valentina's generosity for everything, from her living quarters to the materials for her jewelry work. The arrangement clearly chafed at her independent spirit, though she bore the situation with remarkable grace. Valentina has always been the strong one, Lucia confided during one of our afternoon conversations. She inherited not just father's palazzo, but his talent for managing people. I sometimes think she knows everyone's secrets better than they know them themselves. There was something in her tone that suggested this observation was not entirely complimentary, though she quickly turned the conversation back to artistic matters. I began to notice, however, that Valentina indeed seemed remarkably well informed about the personal affairs of her wide circle of. Her charity work brought her into contact with much of Roman high society, and she possessed an uncanny ability to mention precisely the right detail about someone's business dealings or family circumstance to keep conversations flowing in directions that served her interests. It was Lucia who first suggested that we might invite the famous Hercule Poirot to our upcoming charity ball. Wouldn't it add a certain intellectual distinction to have such a celebrated detective among our guests? She asked one day, as I watched her work in a particularly intricate silver piece. Valentina is always looking for ways to make our gatherings more memorable. The idea struck me as inspired. I had, of course, read accounts of the little Belgian detective's remarkable cases, and the prospect of meeting such a distinguished man appealed to my scholarly nature. When I mentioned the suggestion to Valentina, she seized upon it with characteristic enthusiasm. "Brilliant, Marcus," she exclaimed. Using the familiar form of address she had adopted after our first few months of working together, "I shall write to him immediately. A detective of his caliber would certainly elevate the tone of our little gathering." As I watched her draft the invitation with her characteristic flair for dramatic presentation, I found myself anticipating the meeting with interest. Little did I realize that Poirot's presence would soon cast an entirely different light on the carefully ordered world of the Palazzo Medici, or that my own scholarly objectivity would be put to its most severe test. The weeks following Poirot's acceptance of our invitation brought a curious transformation to the atmosphere within the Palazzo Medici. What had been merely the usual undercurrents of tension that accompany any grand social gathering began to manifest as something more palpable. A sense of anticipation thought bordered on apprehension. Valentina threw herself into the preparations with characteristicity, her energy seeming to increase with each passing day. I observed her movements through the palazzo with the detached interest of a scholar studying a particularly complex subject. She would sweep from room to room, issuing instructions to the household staff with military precision, then pause unexpectedly to make mysterious telephone calls in lowered tones that ceased abruptly whenever anyone approached. "She's been like this for days," Lucia confided to me one afternoon as we worked together in her jewelry workshop. I had taken to spending my free hours there, apparently to observe her techniques for my own academic edification, though I confess, I found her company increasingly pleasant. Sometimes I hear her pacing in her rooms until well past midnight. I looked up from the manuscript. I was reviewing a 17th century treatise on goldsmithing techniques that I thought might interest her. Perhaps she's simply anxious about entertaining such a distinguished guest. The prospect of hosting Hercule Poirot would intimidate many hostesses. Lucia's hands stilled over the delicate silver work she was crafting. "It's more than that, I think. Yesterday I found her going through Papa's old papers in the library. Documents she hasn't touched since the estate was settled. When I asked what she was looking for, she became quite sharp with me. Her distress was evident. and I felt a surge of protective concern that surprised me with its intensity. As a scholar, I was accustomed to maintaining emotional distance from my subjects of study. Yet, I found myself increasingly invested in Lucia's well-being. Perhaps I might speak with her, he suggested carefully. As an outsider to the family, she might be more willing to confide her concerns. Would you? The relief in her voice wasn't mistakable. You have such a calming influence. Dr. Fairfax. Valentina respects your scholarly judgment. I did indeed approach the Contessa the following morning, finding her in the biblioteca, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and yellow-wed correspondence. She looked up as I entered, and I was struck by the strain evident in her usually composed features. "Ah, Marcus," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How goes the cataloguing? I trust you're making satisfactory progress with the Venetian pieces." "Quite satisfactory, thank you. But I must confess, Contessa, I've noticed you seem somewhat preoccupied of late. If there's any way my expertise might be of assistance." She studied me for a long moment, and I sensed her weighing some internal calculation. "You're very observant, aren't you? That's scholarly training, I suppose." "Yes, I have been rather distracted. The truth is, Marcus, I've recently had cause to review certain business relationships. People can be most unreliable when it comes to honoring their obligations." Her words carried an undertone that suggested she was speaking of more than mere financial debts. "I see. And these obligations relate to your upcoming guests." "Some of them." She leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming against its leather arm. "You know, when one moves in certain circles, one inevitably becomes privy to information that others would prefer to keep private. Normally, such knowledge is merely atmospheric, but occasional systems arise that make discretion more valuable than one might initially." I felt a chill at her words, though I maintained my scholarly composure. "That sounds rather delicate." "Indeed it is." She rose and moved to Thorndoe, gazing out at the courtyard where servants were arranging tables for the ball. "Tell me, Marcus, in your professional experience, have you ever encountered artifacts that served purposes beyond their apparent function?" The question echoed so closely Lucia's earlier musings that I felt momentarily disoriented. Certainly hidden compartments in furniture, false bottoms in paintings, such things were common during periods of political instability. "Fascinating." She turned back to me with renewed interest. "And in your estimation, how might one determine the true purpose of an object?" "Through careful examination, typically understanding the historical context, the maker's other work, the circumstances under which it was created." I paused, studying her face. "May I ask, what prompts this line of inquiry?" "Oh, merely idle curiosity." But her tone suggested anything but I've been commissioning some new pieces from local craftsmen, items for the ball, you understand. One wishes to ensure they serve their intended purposes effectively. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lucia, who appeared in the doorway with a sketchpad in her hands. "Forgive me, I didn't realize you were in conference." "Not at all, dear sister," Valentina replied, though I noted a slight tightening around her eyes. "Dr. Fairfax and I were merely discussing the functional aspects of decorative objects. Perhaps you might show him that charming design you've been working on, the one for my new evening shoes." Lucia's cheeks colored slightly. "Oh, that's hardly worth Dr. Fairfax's attention. Just a small project to keep my hands busy." "Nonsense," I interjected. "Genuine licorice, I should be delighted to see your work. Your understanding of form and function has consistently impressed me." She hesitated, then opened her sketchpad to reveal a drawing of remarkable elegance. A woman's evening shoe with a distinctively high, slender heel. The design was both beautiful and somehow unsettling, though I couldn't immediately identify why. "The heel is quite striking," I observed. "The proportions are mathematical in their precision." "Yes," Lucia said quietly. "I wanted to create something that was both beautiful and purposeful. The heel needed to be exactly the right length and thickness to achieve the proper balance. Valentina moved closer to examine the sketch. It's perfect, isn't it? Exactly what we discussed. When will the craftsman have it completed? Tomorrow, I believe, he assured me. The silver work will be finished in time for the ball. Excellent. Valentina's satisfaction was evident. Nothing less than perfection will do for such an important evening. As the sisters continued to discuss the technical details of the shoes construction, I found myself studying their interaction with growing unease. There was something in their exchange, as a text, that suggested layers of meaning I couldn't quite penetrate. Lucia's earlier distress seemed to have been replaced by a curious intensity, while Valentina appeared almost triumphant. Later that evening, as I returned to my own quarters in the palazzo's guest wing, I reflected on the desk. The scholar in me recognized that I was observing a complex dynamic between these sisters, one that extended far beyond simple sibling rivalry. Yet, despite my training in careful analysis, I found myself unable to piece together the true nature of what I was witnessing. What troubled me most was my growing concern for Lucia's welfare. Her gentle nature seemed increasingly at odds with the charged atmosphere surrounding the preparations, and I found myself wishing I could offer her some refuge from whatever storm was gathering within the palazzo's elegant walls. The evening of the charity ball arrived with all the splendor that Valentina's meticulous planning had promised. The Palazzo Medici had been transformed into a glittering stage worthy of the Renaissance masters whose works adorn its walls. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors polished to mirror brightness, while banks of white roses and jasmine filled the air with their intoxicating perfume. I had positioned myself near the entrance to the grand ballroom, ostensibly to observe the arriving guests for my own scholarly interest in European society, though I confess my primary concern was ensuring that Lucia felt comfortable throughout the evening. She had seemed increasingly nervous as the day progressed, and I had taken it upon myself to serve as her quiet guardian against any social difficulties that might arise. Hercule Poirot's arrival created precisely the stir that Valentina had anticipated. The little Belgian detective, impeccably dressed in evening wear that somehow managed to be both perfectly conventional and distinctly foreign, moved through the reception with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading character from gesture and expression. I found myself studying him with professional fascination. Here was a mind that approached human behavior with the same methodical precision I applied to artistic attribution. Quite the distinguished gathering, I remarked to Lucia as we watched the detective's initial interactions with other guests. She stood beside me in a gown of pale blue silk that complemented her delicate coloring, though I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her wrap. Yes, she replied quietly. Valentina has outdone herself, though I sometimes wonder if such elaborate displays serve any purpose beyond showing off one's connections. There was an unusual edge to her voice that surprised me. Lucia rarely spoke critically of her sister's social ambitions, and I found myself studying her profile with concern. Are you quite well this evening? You seem rather tense. She turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Forgive me, Dr. Fairfax. Large always make me somewhat anxious. I much prefer the quiet of my workshop to all this performance. Before I could respond, the orchestra struck up the opening notes of a waltz, and couples began forming on the dance floor. Valentina, resplendent in a gown of deep emerald silk, and wearing the silver stiletto shoes that Lucia had designed, moved, with characteristic fin toward the center of the room. She had indeed surpassed herself. Every detail of her appearance spoke of wealth and tastes, from the diamond necklace that caught the light, with each movement to the perfectly arranged coiffure that framed her striking features. I observed the evening's progression with the detail of a scholar documenting social rituals. The various guests, Italian nobility, wealthy expatriates, prominent art collectors moved through their practiced routines of conversation and display. Poirot, I noted, seemed particularly adept at drawing confidences from those around him, his manner somehow inspiring trust, while his sharp eyes missed nothing. It was during the third waltz that he noticed Lucia slip away from the ballroom. I had been engaged in conversation with Count Alessandro regarding the provenance of a disputed Caravaggio when I realized she was no longer visible among the dancers. Concerned for her well-being, she had seemed so agitated earlier, excused myself and went in search of her. The palazzo's corridors were dimly lit compared to the brilliant ballroom, creating pools of shadow between thule sconces that made navigation somewhat treacherous for someone unfamiliar with the layout. I made my way toward the family's private quarters, thinking Lucia might have retreated there for a moment of solitude. It was as I approached the door to Valentina's sitting room that I heard scream. The sound cut through the distant music like a blade through silk, high, piercing, and unmistakably filled with terror. I rushed forward, my scholar's instincts overwhelmed by more immediate human concerns. The door to the sitting room stood ajar, and I pushed it open to reveal a scene that will remain etched in my memory until my dying day. Valentina lay sprawled across the Persian carpet, her emerald gown spread around her like spilled paint. The silver stiletto shoe, Lucia's exquisite creation, protruded from her chest at an impossible angle, its heel buried deep in her heart. Blood had begun to pool beneath her body, staining the pale silk of her undergarments and spreading across the carpet's intricate pattern. It stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, but must have been mere seconds. My academic mind struggling to process the transformation of elegant evening shoe into instrument of death. The heel, I realized with growing horror, had been modified in some way. What should have been a hollow structure designed merely for height and elegance had become something far more sinister. Lucia appeared in the doorway behind me, her face pale with shock. "Oh God," she whispered, one hand pressed to her mouth. "Dr. Fairfax, what has happened?" "Don't come closer," I managed to say, finally finding my voice. "This is a crime scene. We must summon help immediately." She nodded mutely, her eyes fixed on her sister's motionless form. I noticed that her earlier nervousness had been replaced by a strange sort of stillness, as though the shock had numbed her completely. "Should I fetch Monsieur Poirot?" she asked. "Yes, and the police as well. But first, we must ensure that no one else enters this room." I positioned myself in theater way, blocking the view of Valentina's body, while Lucia hurried away to raise the alarm. As I waited in that terrible silence, broken only by the distant sounds of music and laughter from the continuing ball, I found myself examining the scene with unwilling fascination. The position of the body, the angle of the weapon, the spray pattern of blood across the furniture, all spoke of violence, sudden and precise. Yet something nagged at my scholarly consciousness, some detail that seemed inconsistent with the apparent circumstance. When Poirot arrived, followed closely by several other guests and the palazzo staff, he took immediate command of the situation, with quiet authority. The local commissario di polizia was summoned, and within the hour, the glittering social gathering had transformed into something far more grim. I remained close to Lucia throughout the initial confusion, noting how she answered the preliminary questions with calm precision. Despite her obvious distress, her shock seemed genuine, yet I detected something else beneath it, a quality I couldn't quite identify, but that reminded me oddly of relief. As the evening wore on, and the investigation began in earnest, I found myself thinking not of the brilliant social occasion that had been ruined, but of the conversation Lucia and I had shared, about objects serving purpose tiering their apparent function. The silver stiletto shoe, so beautiful in its original design, had indeed hidden a capability that none of us had suspected, except perhaps for the persona had engineered its deadly transformation. The following morning dawned gray and oppressive over Rome, as though the Varischi sympathized with the tragedy that had befallen the Palazzo Medici. I had passed a sleepless night in my quarters, my mind returning repeatedly to the horrible scene in Valentina's sitting room. The image of that beautiful silver shoe transformed into an instrument of death seemed to epitomize some fundamental perversion of art's noble purpose. Hercule Poirot had established himself in the Palazzo's morning room, which the Commissar di Polizia had graciously allowed him to use as his base of operations. I found him there shortly after breakfast, examining the murder weapon with the concentrated attention of a scholar studying a precious manuscript. The silver stiletto lay upon a white cloth, its elegant lines somehow obscured in the harsh light of day. "Ah, Dr. Fairfax," Poirot said, without looking up from his examination. "You were most prompt. I was hoping you might assist me with certain technical aspects of this remarkable object." I approached the table with considerable reluctance, my scholarly instincts warring with natural revulsion. "I'm not certain how much help I can provide, Monsieur Poirot. My expertise lies in authentication and provenance, not in this sort of modification. Nevertheless, you're trained, I may observe details that escape others." He gestured toward the shoe with unmeticulously manicured hand. "Regard, if you please, the heel construction. What do you make of it?" Forcing myself to examine the weapon objectively, I was struck immediately by the sophistication of the alteration. The hollow interior of the heel had been fitted with a slender steel blade, spring-loaded and triggered by pressure applied to the toe of the shoe. The mechanism was invisible from the outside, concealed within what appeared to be a perfectly normal, if unusually aged, evening shoe. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," I admitted, unable to suppress my professional appreciation despite the circumstances. This required considerable skill, knowledge of both metallurgy and mechanical engineering. The spring mechanism alone represents hours of precise work. Poirot nodded slowly. "Precisement. This is not the work of an amateur. Someone with access to specialized tools and considerable expertise created this modification." He paused, fixing me with those penetrating green eyes. "Tell me, Doctor, in your time at the Palazzo, have you encountered anyone with such technical capabilities?" I found myself thinking immediately of Floccia's jewelry workshop, with its array of specialized tools and her obvious skill in metalwork. Yet the thought of connecting her gentle nature to such a vicious contrivance seemed almost blasphemous. "Miss Lucia has considerable talent with jewelry design," I said carefully. "But this level of mechanical sophistication, I find it difficult to imagine." "Ah, but you have observed her work closely, have you not? Perhaps you might show me her workshop." The request filled me with unease, though I could hardly refuse. As we made our way through the Palazzo's corridors, I found myself hoping desperately that nothing in Lucia's sanctuary would implicate her in this terrible business. She had suffered enough trauma already without being subjected to suspicion. The workshop occupied a sun-filled chamber on the Palazzo's upper floor, its tables arranged with the methodical precision that characterized all of Floccia's endeavors. Poirot moved through the space like a bloodhound, following a scent, his attention caught by various tools and partially completed projects. "Most interesting," he murmured, examining a delicate silver bracelet still in progress. "The workmanship shows remarkable skill. And these tools, they are professional quality, are they not?" "Miss Lucia takes her craft seriously," I replayed, watching anxiously as he continued his examination. "She studied with master craftsmen in Florence before returning to Rome." Indeed, Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "And during this training, would she have learned technico-explical, too, shall we say, more complex, mechanical work?" Before I could respond, Lucia herself appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. "Dr. Fairfax," I heard voices and thought, that is, I wondered if there was anything I might do to assist your investigation. "Monsieur Rossetti." Poirot turned to her with his characteristic courtly manner. "I was just admiring your workshop. Dr. Fairfax tells me you studied in Florence. Yes, for 2 years. Her voice remained steady, though I noticed her hands clasping and unclasping nervously. Under Maestro Giovanni Collini, he specializes in restoration of historical pieces. Fascinating. And during this time, did you perhaps learn technique whisper concealed mechanisms, hidden compartments, and such? Lucia's color deepened slightly. Some, yes. Renaissance jewelers often incorporated secret elements into their work, poison rings, concealed blades, mechanisms for hiding documents. It was part of understanding the historical context of the pieces we restored. I felt my heart sink at her admission, even as I admired her honesty. Poirot, however, seemed to take this revelation in stride. Most educational, I'm sure. Tell me, the silver shoe that was modified. You designed this originally for your sister, did you not? Yes. Her voice became barely audible. She requested something special for the ball. She wanted, Lucia paused, seeming to struggle with her words. She wanted something that would make an impression, something memorable. The irony of this statement hung heavy in the air. Poirot continued his examination of the workshop while I watched Lucia with growing concern. Her composure seemed fragile, as though the slightest pressure might shatter her completely. Dr. Fairfax, she said suddenly, turning to me with desperate eyes, you didn't think? Surely no one could suspect. I mean, the fact that I designate the shoe doesn't mean of course not, I said firmly, though my own doubts were multiplying with each revelation. The design of a shoe and its later modification are entirely separate matters. Poirot looked up from his examination of a set of precision files. Indeed, the creation of the original design requires very different skills from the mechanical modification. However, both require intimate knowledge of the object's construction. He paused meaningfully. Tell me, mademoiselle, who else had access to the completed shoe before last evening? Only the craftsman who made it, Signor Toretti on the Via del Corso, and Valentina, of course, and myself. We collected it together just yesterday afternoon. Ah, Signor Toretti. I should very much like to speak with this gentleman. Perhaps, Dr. Fairfax, you would accompany me. Your expertise in evaluating craftsmanship might prove invaluable. As we prepared to leave the workshop, I caught Lucia's hand briefly. Try not to worry, I whispered. Monsieur Poirot is renowned for his fairness. The truth will emerge. She squeezed my fingers gratefully, and he was struck by how cold her hand felt despite the warmth of the morning. Thank you, Dr. Fairfax. Your kindness has meant more to me than you know. Walking away from the palazzo with Poirot, I found myself torn between my scholarly obligation to support the investigation and my growing personal concern for Lucia's welfare. The evidence was beginning to paint a picture that I desperately did not wish to see completed, yet my training in objective analysis made it impossible to ignore mounting implications. Our journey to Signor Toretti's workshop led us through the winding streets of old Rome, past ancient columns and Renaissance facades that spoke to my historian soul. Even amid the present crisis, Poirot walked with his characteristic measured pace, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of our surroundings, while his mind, I suspected, worked through the complex web of evidence we had already gathered. The craftsman's establishment occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on the Via del Corso, its windows displaying an array of elegant shoes and leather goods that spoke of generations of skilled workmanship. A small brass plaque beside the door proclaimed Giuseppe Toretti Calzolaio, established 1898, and the workshop beyond exuded the timeless atmosphere of traditional Italian craftsmanship. Signor Toretti himself proved to be a man of perhaps 60 years, with the weathered hands and keen eyes of one who had spent his life working with precision tools. He received us with the courteous weariness that small businessmen often display when confronted by official investigations. Though his manner warmed considerably when I introduced myself as the art historian, cataloging the Palazzo Medici collection. Ah, the English professor, he exclaimed in accented but excellent English. Miss Lucia, she speaks of you often, Such a gentle signorina, and so talented with the silver work. A tragedy, this business with her sister. Such a beautiful woman, the Contessa. Poirot allowed me to conduct the initial conversation, recognizing that my established relationship with the family would put the craftsman more at ease. We're trying to understand exactly how shoe was modified, I explained carefully. When did you last see the Silver Stiletto? Yesterday afternoon, when the ladies came to collect it. Perfect. It was my finest work in months. His pride was evident, even tinged as it was with the horror of subsequent events. The silver heel so precisely balanced the curve of the toe exactly to Miss Lucia's specifications and the internal structure of the heel. Poirot interjected gently. You created this as a normal shoe, with the standard hollow construction. Natural, meant solid silver, would be too heavy and impossible to walk in. The heel is formed around a wooden core with the silver shaped and fitted over it. Touretti's expression grew troubled. But I hear now that someone they make changes to my beautiful work. This breaks my heart. I watched the craftsman's face carefully as Poirot described the mechanical modification that had transformed the elegant shoe into a lethal weapon. His hock appeared genuine, and his technical questions about the spring mechanism revealed a professional interest that seemed entirely innocent. Such work would require special tools, Touretti mused, shaking his gray head. Not the tools of a shoemaker, but of a chimicoan engineer, someone who understands the metal springs, the pressure plates. Indeed, Poirot agreed, and such a person would need access to the completed shoe for several hours, would they not? Seycharan to remove the heel, create the cavity for the blade, install the mechanism. This is work of many hours, very careful, very precise. As we concluded our interview with the craftsman, I found myself relieved that nothing he had told us implicated Lucia directly. Yet the technical requirements he described only served to narrow the field of possible suspects to those with both opportunity and expertise, a category that unfortunately seemed to include the very person I most wished to protect. Our return journey to the palazzo was interrupted by a commotion. Near the Spanish Steps, a crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an accident. A heavy piece of scaffolding had fallen from a building under restoration, missing a pedestrian by mere inches. The victim, I was startled to recognize, was Prince Dimitri, one of the guests from the previous evening's ball. Ah, Poirot murmured as we approached the scene. Most fortunate that the gentleman was not injured. Such accidents can be most convenient. The prince, a tall man, with the bearing of old Russian aristocracy, was being attended to by several concerned passers-by. Though clearly shaken, he appeared unharmed, and his primary concern seemed to be the papers scattered from his briefcase. When he had thrown himself clear of the falling debris, Prince Dimitri, I called out, recognizing an opportunity to express concern, while perhaps learning more about the previous evening's events. Are you quite all right? He looked up, his pale eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and something else. Was it fear, Dr. Fairfax? Yes, I am unharmed, thanks be to God. But this, he gestured at the scattered documents he was hastily gathering. Most inconvenient timing for such an accident. Poirot, with his characteristic directness, knelt to help retrieve the papers. Indeed, accidents have a way of occurring at the most unfortunate moments, he observed mildly. I trust last evening's tragic events have not affected your travel plans. The prince's hand stilled for just a moment. Travel plans? No, I have business in Rome for several more days, though perhaps it would be wise to change hotels. The memories, you understand? As we assisted in gathering his belongings, I noticed that several of the scattered documents bore official-looking seals and foreign postmarks. When the prince caught me observing them, his expression hardened slightly. Government business, he said curtly, securing the papers in his briefcase with unnecessary force. Most boring bureaucratic matters. Later, as we continued our walk back to the palazzo, Poirot seemed thoughtful. Curious, is it not, how accidents seem to follow in the wake of murder? One wonders if someone believes the princess knows more than is comfortable. You think the falling scaffolding was deliberate? In my experience, Monsieur Doctor, coincidences are far rarer than most people suppose. When a man narrowly escapes death the day after witnessing a murder, the prudent investigator constores all possibilities. We found Lucia in the palazzo's garden, sitting beside the fountain that had been installed by some long-dead Medici. She looked up as we approached, and I was struck by how fragile she appeared in the afternoon light, like a Renaissance Madonna, painted in sorrow rather than joy. "Dr. Fairfax," she said, rising gracefully. "Monsieur Poirot, I hope your inquiries have been productive." "Indeed," Mademoiselle Poirot replied, "though I confess the picture grows more complex with each new piece of information. Tell me, did your sister ever speak to you of Prince Dimitri? Of any business they might have conducted together?" Lucia's brow furrowed in concentration. "Not specifically, though. Valentina often mentioned that many of her guests sought her advice on various matters. She had a talent for understanding Paul's needs, even when they themselves were not entirely clear about what they required." The delicate phrasing of her response struck me as significant, though I couldn't immediately identify why. Poirot, however, seemed to find it illuminating. "Ah, yes, your sister possessed considerably instinct to human nature. Such understanding can be most valuable and most dangerous." As evening approached, and we prepared to return to our respective quarters, I remained troubled by the day's revelations. The investigation was proceeding with Poirot's characteristic methodical precision, yet each new discovery seemed to deepen, rather than clarify, the mystery surrounding Valentina's death. Most disturbing of all was my growing realization that Lucia's involvement in the case extended far beyond the simple fact of her having designed the murder weapon. Chapter 6. Mirrors and Masks. Chapter 6. Mirrors and Masks. The third day of the investigation dawned with the oppressive humidity that often presages a Roman thunderstorm. I had spent another restless night, my dreams haunted by images of silver shoes and scattered documents, and I rose with the peculiar sensation that events were moving towards some inevitable conclusion that I could not yet perceive. Poirot had requested my assistance in Valentina's private papers, a task that required delicate handling given the sensitive nature of what we might discover. The commissario had granted permission for this search, recognizing that my academic credentials and established position within the household made me an appropriate witness to any revelations that might emerge. Valentina's private study was a shrine to organized sophistication. Every surface gleamed with careful maintenance, and her correspondence was filed with the precision of a government archive. As we began our systematic examination, I found myself impressed despite everything by her methodical approach to record-keeping. "Remarkable," I observed, opening a file cabinet that contained what appeared to be detailed biographical information, anecdotes of prominent Roman citizens. She certainly took an interest in her social circle. Poirot examined a leather-bound ledger, with the attention of an accountant reviewing suspicious books. "More than interest, I think." Observed the notation, system, dates, amounts, cryptic references. This suggests a more systematic approach to gathering information. As we continued our search, the true scope of Valentina's activities became increasingly apparent. The files contained not merely social gossip, but documentation of financial irregularities, romantic indiscretions, and political associations that could prove damaging to those involved. It was, in essence, a comprehensive catalogue of vulnerability and shame. "Dr. Fairfax," Poirot said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of discovery, "this file here, it bears your name." My blood chilled as he handed me a folder containing copies of my academic correspondence, details of my professional appointments, and even a photograph taken apparently without my knowledge of myself entering Lucia's workshop. The file was thin, compared to many others, but its very existence filled me with unease. I had no idea she was investigating me, I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. Indeed, yet you have been a frequent visitor to the palazzo for many months. Natural, perhaps, that she would wish to know more about someone with such access to her home and her sister. Before I could respond to this observation, Lucia appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, and she carried herself with the careful control of someone fighting strong emotion. "Forgive the intrusion," she said quietly. "I heard voices and thought, that is, wondered, if you had discovered anything that might help identify Valentina's killer." Poirot gestured toward the filing cabinets with a sweep of his hand. "Your sister, she was most thorough in documenting the affairs of others. Did you know the extent of her research?" Lucia's gaze moved to the open files, and I saw her shoulders sag slightly. He suspected something of the sort. She always seemed to know things about people that they had never told her. He thought, perhaps it was just natural intuition, but this, she gestured helplessly at the evidence before us. "And you never asked her directly about these activities?" "One did not question Valentina's methods," Lucia replied with a bitterness that surprised me. She had ways of making it clear that such questions were unwelcome. I found myself studying her face as she spoke, noting the tension around her eyes, and the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. The strain of the investigation was clearly taking its toll. Yet, there was something else in her expression, a quality I had begun to recognize, but couldn't quite name. Our search was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Dorothy Whitman, the American eyes who had attended the ball. She burst into its study with a sort of dramatic flair that suggested either genuine distress or carefully calculated performance. "Monsieur Poirot," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the distinctly transatlantic accent of wealthy Americans abroad, "he simply must speak with you immediately. I've discovered something that may be of vital importance to your investigation." The something proved to be a letter that Miss Whitman claimed to have found in her hotel room, a letter alleged by Valentina and containing veiled threats about uncomfortable revelations that might emerge if certain conditions were not met. "When did you receive this communication?" Poirot inquired, examining the document with his usual care. "It was slipped under my door sometime during the night. I found it this morning when I returned from breakfast." Miss Whitman's hands fluttered nervously as she spoke. "The implications are quite clear, don't you think? Someone is continuing Valentina's business, even after her death." I watched this exchange with growing fascination, noting the way Lucius had changed when Miss Whitman produced the letter. There was something almost like recognition in her eyes, though she said nothing. "Most curious," Poirot murmured, his attention focused on the paper itself rather than its contents. "The stationery appears to match that used by the Contessa, yet certain details of the handwriting." He paused, comparing the letter to some of Valentina's writing that we had found among her papers. The examination continued for several minutes, during which Miss Whitman grew increasingly agitated. "Surely the important thing is the content, not the penmanship," she said finally. "Someone is trying to continue Valentina's blackmail scheme. We must identify this person before they destroy innocent lives." "Indeed," Poirot agreed mildly, "though one must also consider the possibility that this letter serves a purpose other than continuing blackmail. Perhaps it is intended to, how shall I put this, redirect attention from the true perpetrator of the original crime. The implications of this suggestion hung heavy in the air. Miss Whitman's face flushed with indignation, while Lucia seemed to shrink further into herself. Later that afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over the city, and the first drops of rain began to fall against the palazzo's ancient windows, I found me alone with Lucia in her workshop. She had retreated there after Themernin's revelations, and I had followed out of concern for her emotional state. Dr. Fairfax Chaussade Without looking up from the piece of silver wire she was absently twisting between her fingers. "Do you think Monsieur Poirot suspects me of killing Valentina?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. "What makes you ask such a thing?" The way he looks at me, the questions he asks, and now discovering the extent of Valentina. I suppose anyone would wonder if I had finally reached the breaking point. I moved closer, noting how the afternoon light caught the gold in her hair and cast shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and profound worry. "Lucia," I said gently, using her given name for the first time, "you must know that I would never believe you capable of such violence." She looked up then, and in her eyes I saw a depth of pain that went far beyond grief for her murdered sister. "Thank you," she whispered. "Your faith in me means more than you know." As evening approached and the storm intensified outside, I remained in the workshop, ostensibly helping Lucy organize her tools, but actually serving as her protector against whatever new revelations the investigation might bring. The truth was becoming increasingly complex, and I found myself desperately hoping that when all was finally revealed, the gentle woman beside me would emerge unscathed from the wreckage of her sister's schemes. The fourth morning of Poirot's brought with it a sense of impending resolution that seemed to permeate the very stones of the Palazzo Medici. I had awakened before dawn with the peculiar certainty that this day would bring answers, though whether those answers would provide the relief I desperately sought remained to be seen. Poirot had requested a private meeting with me in the morning room, and I approached this interview with considerable trepidation. His manner had grown increasingly thoughtful over the past day, and I sensed that his remarkable mind was assembling the scattered pieces of evidence into a coherent pattern. "Dr. Fairfax," he began without preamble, as I entered the sun-filled chamber, "he believed the time has come for complete candor between us. There are aspects of this case that require clarification. If justice is to be served," I settled into the chair opposite him, noting how the morning light seemed to sharpen his already penetrating gaze. "I'm not certain what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. I have endeavored to be entirely honest in all my statements." "Indeed. Then perhaps you will not object to explaining certain discrepancies in your account of the evening's events." He consulted a small notebook, his movements precise and deliberate. "You stated that you discovered Miss Lucia absent from the ballroom during the third waltz, and that concern for her welfare prompted you to search for her." "That is correct. Yet, Count Alessandro, with whom you claim to have been discussing the disputed Caravaggio, has no recollection of any such conversation. Indeed, he states quite clearly that he did not speak with you at all that evening." My throat seemed to constrict, making speech difficult. Perhaps the Count's memory is imperfect. The evening was quite eventful. Perhaps Poirot's tone suggested Heffen, this explanation inadequate. "Tell me, Doctor, what was your precise relationship with Miss Lucia Rossetti? Professional consultation only, as you have indicated, or something more personal?" The directness of his question left me with no room for evasion. That is, my professional admiration for her work had perhaps developed into something deeper, but I assure you, my feelings were entirely honorable. Now we approach honesty. And these feelings, did Miss Lucia reciprocate them? I found myself staring at my hands, unable to meet his knowing gaze. I believed, that is, I hoped she, si medto, welcomed my company. Indeed, she did. In fact, your relationship had progressed considerably beyond what either of you has admitted to the authorities. You had, in fact, declared your love for her, had you not? The words seemed to tear themselves from my throat. Yes. 3 weeks ago in her workshop, he told her that I could no longer maintain the pretense of mere professional interest. And her response? She was receptive, but she said that Valentina would never permit such a relationship, that her sister controlled every aspect of her life, including her romantic attachments. The memory of that conversation brought with it a surge of the helpless rage I had felt at Lucia's plight. She spoke of feeling trapped, of longing for freedom, but seeing no way to achieve it. Poirot nodded slowly, as though my confession merely confirmed what he had already deduced. Most illuminating, and in the days. This declaration, did Miss Lucia perhaps confide other concerns to you, specific fears about her sister? I hesitated, knowing that each word I spoke drew Lucia deeper into suspicion, yet unable to lie in the face of Poirot's relentless logic. She mentioned that Valentina had become increasingly demanding, that she had discovered the extent of her sister's information gathering and was horrified by it. She knew of the blackmail, she suspected it, and she feared that Valentina's victims might eventually turn violent. She spoke of lying awake at night, listening for sounds of intrusion, afraid that someone would come seeking revenge. Yet, despite these fears, she agreed to design a special shoe for her sister, a shoe that would, in her own words, make an impression. The irony of those words, spoken in such innocence, now seemed almost unbearable. She was proud of her craftsmanship, and despite everything, she loved Valentina. Love, Poirot mused, is indeed a powerful force. It can inspire the most nobly actions, and the most desperate ones. He paused, studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. Tell me, Doctor, on the night of the murder, what time did you actually leave Thebel Room? The question struck at the heart of my carefully constructed account. It's difficult to be precise. The evening was chaotic. Dr. Fairfax, his voice carried gentle but implacable authority. I have spoken with numerous witnesses. Your movements that evening could be traced with considerable accuracy. You left the ballroom, not during the third waltz, but nearly an hour earlier. Where did you go? The walls of my deception crumbled beneath his methodical assault. To the library, I whispered. Lucia had asked me to meet her there. She said she needed to speak with me privately about something important. And what was the nature of this conversation? I closed my eyes, remembering that terrible moment when everything changed. She told me that she had discovered something in Valentina's papers, evidence that her sister was planning Tokes-Bozar relationship publicly, to use it as leverage against me in some scheme she was developing. And your reaction to this news? I was furious not at Lucia, but at Valentina's management, at her casual cruelty toward her own sister. My hands clenched, involuntarily at the memory. I told Lucia that I would speak with Valentina myself, that I would not allow her to continue this emotional terrorism. But you did not speak with the Contessa, did you? No. She begged me not to confront her directly. She said it would only make things worse, that Valentina would find new ways to punish us both. I looked up at Poirot, seeing my own defeat reflected in his compassionate ease. She asked for time to think, to find another solution. And so you turned to the ballroom, while Miss Lucia remained in the library, or so I assumed. We agreed to meet again after the ball, to discuss what we might do. Yet when you discovered her near her sister's body, she showed no surprise at your presence, there almost as though she had been expecting you. The observation hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on protecting Lucia that I had failed to notice the very thing that now seemed obvious. You think she planned for me to find them together? I think, Dr. Fairfax, that Miss Lucia, a young woman of considerably more calculation than either of you has admitted, and I think that your devotion to her has perhaps blinded you to certain uncomfortable possibilities. As Poirot's words sank in, I felt the foundation of my understanding shift beneath me. Everything I had believed about that terrible evening, about Lucia's innocence, about my role as her protector, suddenly seemed cast in a different light. The gentlewoman I had sought to shield might not need protection at all. She might, in fact, be far more dangerous than anyone suspected. The final gathering took place in the Palazzo's Grand Salon, where just 5 days earlier the cream of Roman society had danced in glittering splendor. Now the same chamber held an altogether different assembly. The suspects, the investigators, and the truth that Hercule Poirot was about to unveil. I found myself positioned near the tall windows that overlooked the courtyard, Miss Collerly instincts still functioning despite the turmoil in my heart. From this vantage point, I could observe all the participants in this final act of our tragedy. Prince Dmitri, nervous and pale, Miss Dorothy Whitman maintaining her theatrical composure, Count Alessandro fidgeting with his watch chain, and Lucia seated with her characteristic quiet dignity near the fireplace. Poirot had arranged the chairs with characteristic precision, ensuring that each person could see and be seen by a light. The Commissario di Polizia occupied a position of honor, his official presence lending gravity to the proceedings, while I remained standing, uncertain of my own role in what was to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his accented English carrying clearly through the ornate chamber, "we are gathered to examine the death of Contessa Valentina Rossetti, a crime that appeared at first glance to be the desperate act of one driven by endurance by systematic blackmail." He paused, allowing his gaze to move across each face in turn. Indeed, the evidence seemed to point clearly towards such a conclusion. The Contessa had accumulated compromising information about numerous individuals. She possessed the means and inclination to exploit this knowledge for her own advantage. Many of you had reason to fear her, to wish her silenced. Miss Whitman shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Surely you're not suggesting that we were all potential murderers. On the contrary, mademoiselle, I am suggesting that the very obviousness of these motives should have aroused suspicion. In my experience, the most successful murders are often those that appear to solve themselves too neatly." Prince Dmitri cleared his throat nervously. "Then who, in your opinion, committed this terrible crime?" Poirot turned toward Lucia, and I felt my heart clench with dread. "The answer lies not in examining who had reason to kill Valentina Rossetti, but in understanding who possessed the specific combination of opportunity, expertise, and intimate knowledge required to commit this particular murder." "Monsieur Poirot," Lucia said quietly, her voice betraying no emotion, "if you believe I killed my sister, please say so directly. This prolonged suspense serves no one. But you see, mademoiselle, while you certainly possessed the technical knowledge to modify the shoe, and while you undoubtedly had access to the weapon, you did not act alone." His eyes moved to me with devastating precision. "Dr. Marcus Fairfax, perhaps you would care to explain your true role in these events?" The moment I had dreaded was upon me. I felt the weight of every gaze in the room, but most particularly the disappointed eyes of the Commissario and the knowing stare of the little Belgian detective. My academic training had taught me to value truth above all else. Yet here I stood, my entire carefully constructed narrative crumbling around me. My voice cracked, and I was forced to begin again. "I suppose there is no point in maintaining the pretense any longer." "Indeed, there is not," Poirot agreed gently. "The evidence speaks quite clearly to those who know how to interpret it. Shall I reconstruct the true sequence of events, or would you prefer to make your own confession?" I looked at Lucia, seeking some sign of how I should proceed, but her face remained expressionless. The woman I thought I knew seemed suddenly like a stranger, and I realized that perhaps she always had been. "Very well," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Yes, I helped her plan it. The modification to the shoe was my design, based on my research into Renaissance assassination techniques. The timing, the method of creating an alibi by being discovered together at the scene of this was carefully orchestrated." A collective gasp arose from the assembled witnesses. The Commissario leaned forward intently, while Poirot nodded with satisfaction. "But you must understand," I continued, desperation creeping into my voice. "I never intended for anyone to die. The plan was merely to neutralize Valentina's threat to make her understand that her blackmail schemes would no longer be tolerated." "Ah, but that is not quite accurate, is it, Doctor?" Poirot's voice carried a gentle contradiction. "For you see, the spring mechanism in that shoe was calibrated with mathematical precision. The blade was positioned at exactly the correct angle to pierce the heart. This was not a device designed to threaten. It was an instrument created to kill. My carefully maintained facade finally shattered completely. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, we planned to kill her. Lucia was dying, trapped by her sister's control, destroyed by the constant manipulation and cruelty. I couldn't bear to watch her suffer any longer. And Miss Lucia, what was her role in this conspiracy?" I turned to look at her, this woman for whom I had sacrificed my honor, my career, my very soul. She met my gaze with eyes that held no warmth, no gratitude, no love, only a cold calculation that chilled me to the bone. "She convinced me that murder was the only solution," I said, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. "She made me believe that Valentina's death was a necessity, an act of liberation rather than revenge." "Most illuminating," Poirot observed. "And no, Mademoiselle Lucia, perhaps you would care to comment on Dr. Fairfax's confession." Lucia rose gracefully from her chair, her composure unbroken, even in this moment of ultimate exposure. "I'm afraid Dr. Fairfax has allowed his romantic fantasies to color his perception of events," she said with devastating calm. "While it's true that he approached me with declarations of love, and while he certainly demonstrated an unhealthy obsession with me, supposed suffering, I never encouraged his delusions." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. "Lucia, you cannot mean that. You came home. You told me about the documents. You begged for my help. I did nothing of the sort." Her voice remained level, but I caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating in her eyes. "You constructed an elaborate fantasy in which I was a helpless victim, requiring rescue. When you offered to save me from my sister, I simply didn't discourage you quickly enough." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Indeed, the evidence supports account, Dr. Fairfax. In your obsession with Miss Lucia, you created the murder weapon, you developed the plan, and you carried out the killing, all while believing you were acting on her behalf. But she, clever woman that she is, ensured that your involvement was documented, while her own remained deniable. As the full scope of my manipulation became clear, I felt the last vestige of my self-respect crumble. I had been not Lucia's partner in crime, but her-unwitting tool, a besotted fool, whose academic expertise had been exploited to serve her desire for freedom and inheritance. The commissario rose to place me under arrest, and as the handcuffs closed around my wrists, I realized that my scholarly pursuit of truth had led men to enlightenment, but to the most profound deception of all the lies we tell ourselves about the nature of love and the people we choose to cherish. As I was led from the salon, I caught one final glimpse of Lucia, still seated by the fireplace with perfect composure. She had achieved everything she wanted: her sister's death, her inheritance, and her freedom, while ensuring that another would pay the price for her ambition. In that moment, I understood that I had never truly known her at all. Thanks for joining me for the case of the Silver Stiletto. If you enjoyed this tale of obsession and manipulation, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. What did you think of Dr. Fairfax's shocking confession? Did you suspect him from the beginning, or were you drawn in by his scholarly facade? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, this is Ali signing off from Cafe Tales.